This is the third and final episode of a series I'm calling Who is Cocktail Papa? In this episode, we'll be making 3 drinks using spirits from one distillery called Balcones Distilling. If you don't know already, Balcones Distilling is a distillery in Waco, Texas, where I work. I'm the site director there and have been working there since 2015. I'm not sure if that's actually a big reveal for most of the folks watching this, as this channel still is pretty small. A lot of the people that watch this know me personally. But there's a few of you out there who might have been surprised by that, so the reveal was for you. I started working for Balcones in 2015 for what I thought was going to be a short-term period. I was actually in Waco to get a startup going with some friends, but I ended up leaving that project before it got off the ground. Shortly thereafter, my wife and I were looking at moving back to Portland, and instead, Balcones offered a longer-term position of brewhouse manager. It was an exciting time because Balcones at that point was moving from a 2,500 square foot welding workshop where the company started to a much bigger 65,000 square foot warehouse downtown. While it probably seems like a no-brainer of an opportunity now, at that point in time I was still pretty focused on being a brewer, so this was a pretty difficult decision, but one that I'm ultimately really glad we made. The very first mash we did in the new facility was a 100% roasted blue corn mash, which is what we use for both Baby Blue and for Brimstone. And so the first drink we're going to make today features Baby Blue. It's called an IMPOSTERITA, and it's a riff on a margarita using Baby Blue instead of tequila. Although I wouldn't say Baby Blue actually tastes like tequila, there are some fun flinty agave notes present in the whiskey that make this drink work really well. Let's get into making the IMPOSTERITA. The bottle of Baby Blue I have at my house is actually a Ranger's Special Edition. The contents are the same, it's just kind of a different label if you're looking for it in the store. The recipe calls for 2 ounces of Baby Blue, 1 ounce, 2, 3/4 of an ounce of lime juice. This is just some lime juice that I already pre-squeezed. Yes, it's in a Topo Chico bottle. We also need 3/4 ounce of Cointreau. I used this before in the batch margarita recipe. And finally, we'll add 1/4 ounce of a honey syrup. Normally the recipe calls for an agave syrup, but I'm using a honey syrup today as I'm using it in another drink as well. So 1/4 ounce right here. And we'll shake it up with some ice. Something else I wanted to do is actually to salt the rim. I'm going to cut off 1 wheel that we'll use for the garnish. We can put a little lime around the rim of the glass. Doesn't take much. We'll put the glass upside down over here into the salt. And just like that, we've got a nicely salted rim. I've got my ice. Now let's shake. And also we'll want to strain this one over some ice, so I've got an ice cube in here now as well too. Lastly, just for that garnish, we'll put the lime wheel on top. Cheers. Yeah. One of the cool things about this corn whiskey is that it has some of those flinty agave qualities that you wouldn't find in a much older aged whiskey. And that's because Baby Blue is an intentionally younger whiskey where some of those corn and grain flavors shine through to the finished product. So using it in a cocktail that traditionally features tequila is a fun way to highlight something different that corn whiskey can do. Over time, I learned more about the whiskey making process and took on more responsibility. In 2017, I became the production manager, and then in 2019, I became the distillery manager. And in 2020, something really cool happened. Well, I guess in 2020, COVID happened. Also, we came out with an American single malt called Lineage. It won some really cool awards, including the Whiskey Advocate Top 20 Whiskeys of the Year, and it's my favorite of the core lineup today. If you're enjoying this video, go ahead and like and subscribe now. In 2022, I created a drink called a Penny Ceiling. To say I created it is maybe a little silly. It's a riff on Sam Ross's famous drink, the penicillin. And this one uses a couple of different Balcones whiskeys. We've got Lineage, that American single malt I was talking about, and then also Brimstone, a smoked corn whiskey. In Sam Ross's recipe, he's using a blended scotch and then also a peated Islay single malt. So I'm using the Lineage in place of the blended scotch for the base or most of the cocktail. And then the floater that we'll put on top is actually Brimstone, which brings an oak smoke intensity unlike a peated single malt. We'll start with 2 ounces of Lineage. I hope I have 2 ounces of Lineage. just barely. And then we'll add 3/4 of an ounce of lemon juice, also pre-squeezed, put in a fun bottle. And then we'll use that same honey syrup again, 3/4 of an ounce of honey syrup. This honey syrup, I'll put a recipe in down below. It's just equal parts honey and water heated up until the honey melts. And so it's actually just those 3 ingredients in the tin. We will shake it up with some ice, and then we'll do the Brimstone Floater in a second. Prepared glass over here. We'll double strain it, why not? And then right on top, we'll put a 1/4 ounce of Brimstone. While this certainly will impact the flavor quite a bit, the main goal of putting a floater on the top of the drink is to impact the aroma. Generally, when you're dressing up a cocktail with a garnish, you would put a wedge whenever you want someone to be able to squeeze more juice into their drink, and you put a wheel when you really just want a little decoration. There's plenty of lemon in this drink already, so there's no need to squeeze more into it, but this just kind of gives a signifier from a distance that this drink has lemon in it. Yeah, that Brimstone nose really pops right out of the front. It only takes a tiny amount. Yeah, really nice drink. It hits a lot of the same notes that I really like from the original, the penicillin. It's got the smoke and it's got the whiskey sour base going on. And then the honey is really fun too. The honey that I'm actually using here is a Texas wildflower honey, which is the same honey that is used to make rumble, which I used in the coffee episode a couple weeks ago. My goal with this one isn't really to invent a new drink. Obviously, with the name, I'm even tying back to the penicillin, but to use some of our Balcones local spirits to kind of nod to the modern classic of the penicillin. While the first 2 drinks in this episode were shaken and citrus forward, this one is a stirred Manhattan variation called a Red Hook. A Red Hook normally calls for rye whiskey, but today I'm going to be using our Texas single malt. Within the narrative arc of Balcones, Baby Blue was the first whiskey we came out with, and Lineage is actually the most recent core whiskey we've come out with. Our original Texas single malt, though, I would say is one of the whiskeys that helped put American single malt on the map about a dozen years ago or so. As I alluded to earlier, whenever I started working at Balcones, I still identified more as a brewer than as a distiller. And it took me a long time to realize that the project I was working on was a lot more interesting and exciting than I was giving it credit for. There's an author by the name of Dr. Benjamin Hardy, and he has a book called The Gap and the Gain. In short, the gap is the idea that you're living with a perspective that you're comparing what's going on right now to some kind of future, potentially unattainable idea, while the gain is looking how far you've come and looking at what you've achieved and looking at how great things are today. It's really just a mindset shift. It doesn't change anything about your specific circumstances, but that framing was really useful to me personally. For a long time, I viewed my work as just that, and my hobbies as something separate. So maybe it's a bit on the nose, but this episode in particular is a fun sort of evidence of that decompartmentalization from the hobbies and the work. Also, this is as good a time as any to address the name of the channel. I'm married and have 3 kids who call me Papa, and Cocktail Papa seemed like a fun way to combine what I'm doing with the channel, cocktails, with a little bit about who I am. So let's get into the ingredients that we're going to use today to make the Red Hook. Texas single malt is an American single malt that came out in 2010, 2011, and it uses a heritage Scottish malted barley variety called Golden Promise. We'll also use Punta Mess, which is a sweet vermouth that actually is made with a little bit of Amaro. Punta Mess means 1.5, and so the idea is that it's 1 part sweet vermouth and a 1/2 part of Amaro. We'll also use a maraschino liqueur called Luxardo, or Luxardo, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And this one will give some cherry character to the cocktail. So let's start building. We'll start with 2 ounces of Texas single malt. We'll use a 1/2 ounce of Punta Mess. And also a 1/2 ounce of maraschino liqueur. So now we'll grab our ice and also a glass from the freezer. In the first 2 drinks today, you may have noticed I didn't grab a glass from the freezer. And that's because when they're served over a big ice cube, it stays plenty cold on its own. And while I'm sure a frozen glass couldn't hurt anything, it's really more important whenever you're serving a drink up. Pour the ice in and we'll get stirring. So usually with a stirred cocktail, you're looking for about 25 to 30 seconds of stirring. It should add about 20 to 25% of volume to your cocktail in the form of water. I actually like to garnish this one before I put the drink in the glass. Something about getting to see the little bit of cherry syrup on the bottom is kind of fun when you're pouring in the drink. As you can see, those little drips. I let a few in there. I'm not sure if that's part of the recipe, but I won't tell anyone. Strain this right over the top. Yeah, that cocktail just has such a richness to it. I wouldn't say it's overly sweet, really. It does certainly use some sweet components, but the Puntames, because it has that Amaro, kind of helps keep things balanced. It keeps things a little bit more bitter. This is also a pretty rich and intense spirit. It's bottled at 106 proof, and even though it is an American single malt instead of being a rye or maybe even a bourbon, it has an oak intensity to it. It uses predominantly first use oak. And what that means is that even though it's not a bourbon, this flavor profile is really oak driven. So it works really well in a kind of sweeter, richer cocktail like this. And I don't know if I did a particularly good job or it's really just kind of a fun change up for the more citrusy based cocktails, but this is really nice. I do personally tend to go more for the stirred cocktails than the shaken ones, though we're in Texas summer and a shaken drink is pretty nice sometimes too. This drink is a fun one for me to end the episode on too, because it's one of my wife's favorites. And even though I can't let the kids try it, sometimes I'll let them have a cherry. That's all for the Balcones drinks today. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 of Who is Cocktail Papa, there's a coffee episode and a beer episode as well. I'll put some links up here so you guys can see those too. At the end of the day, drinks are for fun. My goal with this channel is to teach people enough so they can share that fun with the people they love. Come and be amazed at what you can do. Cheers.